The neighborhood had a strange kind of stillness the morning I arrived. Too clean, too perfect, too polished. Like a place that wanted you to believe it had no flaws. Maple Ridge Estate sat under a soft wash of sunlight, its lawns trimmed with military precision. Its sidewalks swept clean, as though dust itself knew better than to settle here. Everything was quiet in a way that almost felt rehearsed, as if the whole street was holding its breath, waiting for you to notice the hidden cracks beneath the shine. The moving truck pulled away, leaving me standing alone at the edge of my new driveway. A fresh start, that was the plan. A quiet retirement. Simple routines. Evenings in the garden. Mornings spent listening to the wind instead of the world. The kind of peace a man only starts to crave once he's seen enough of life to know how rare it truly is. But even then, even before the first box was unpacked, something fell off. A curtain on the house across the street twitched. A porch door 2 houses down eased open just enough for someone to peek out. Whispers floated faintly, the kind that stopped just short of forming words. The street watched, but pretended not to. I took a slow breath, letting the silence settle around me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe this was just how these neighborhoods operated. Tight-knit, curious, cautious about newcomers. I'd dealt with enough gated communities in my land surveying years to know the type, but the feeling stayed like a weight on the back of my mind. I walked toward the front door, ready to start unpacking, when footsteps approached from behind. Light, quick, purposeful. I turned, and there she was, a woman in her late 40s, hair pulled back, so tight it looked sculpted into place, carrying a clipboard like it was an extension of her arm. Her smile stretched wide, polite, but sharp around the edges. She didn't introduce herself with a greeting. She introduced herself with authority. A laminated badge hung from her neck, gleaming under the sun. Homeowners Association, board member, enforcement division, and written neatly beneath the title, Karen. She didn't offer a handshake. She offered a paper, my first welcome notice, printed in crisp bold letters. A list of initial concerns regarding property compliance, typed neatly beneath the header. I hadn't lived here 3 minutes. The breeze shifted. Her perfume carried something sweet but suffocating. Fitting for a woman who stood as if she were the law incarnate. Her voice had that tone, too. Cold, clipped precise. The grass was half an inch too long. The mailbox needed repainting. My moving truck had parked past the allowed minutes on community roads. Every sentence came out like a verdict. The house behind her opened. A man stepped outside, tall, wearing sunglasses despite the shade. He nodded to Karen like a soldier acknowledging commander. Another resident crossed the street, pretending to check their mailbox but stared the entire time. It was clear from the moment she spoke. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was an enforcer, the queen of compliance, the rule book in human form. And she had chosen her target. The first hour in Maple Ridge Estates told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a neighborhood. It was a stage. And every person on the street was playing their part, scripted in whispers and regulations and invisible lines you weren't meant to cross. Karen handed me the notice and left without another word, her steps sharp across the pavement. The others drifted away behind her, doors closing quietly, eyes disappearing behind curtains. The perfect little street returned to its perfect little silence. But now the silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, waiting. The sun moved behind a cloud, dimming the brightness. I stepped inside my new home and closed the door, the sound echoing in the hollow rooms. There would be many more echoes before the week was over. Footsteps where they shouldn't be. Voices outside my window. Shadows along the fence line. That didn't belong to me. The neighborhood had been quiet when I arrived. It wouldn't stay quiet for long, because the moment Karen marked my name on her clipboard, the war had already begun. The first night in Maple Ridge Estates carried a strange weight. Boxes sat half, open in the hallway, the house echoing with a familiar emptiness of fresh beginnings. Yet even as I moved quietly from room to room, setting things in place, the air held a tension I couldn't quite name. Not danger, not fear, something subtler, a feeling of being observed. Outside, the sun dipped beneath the trees, leaving the street bathed in soft amber light. The kind of calm that should have been comforting. But every time I glanced out the window, that calm felt staged, too perfect, too curated, like the neighborhood was performing for me rather than living. Sometime after sunset, the sound began, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap from the backyard. Soft, steady, deliberate. Not wind, not branches, something else. I stepped toward the sliding glass door, careful, quiet, beyond the reflection. Shapes shifted near the fence line. Not full forms, just silhouettes, passing by with slow movements, as if pacing the boundary. No voices, no footsteps on gravel, just presence. And then just as quickly gone. The tapping stopped. Silence returned. But the feeling lingered all the way into the night. I slept lightly, waking to the faint sound of mail being slipped through the front slot. A quiet shuffle of paper. Nothing more. Morning brought sunlight and the illusion of normalcy. Birds chirped faintly. Lawnmowers hummed in the distance. It almost felt peaceful, until I found the envelope waiting for me on the floor. The paper was thick, official, folded with meticulous precision. I opened it, expecting another generic welcome brochure. What I found instead was a violation notice. Unapproved guard materials placed in visible area. I frowned, scanning the yard through the front window. Nothing had been placed there. No tools, no pots, no bags. Yet the violation was stamped with urgency. A signature at the bottom, neat cursive, Karen. I hadn't even unpacked my tools. It wasn't about the garden. It wasn't about the rules. It was a message. I stepped onto the porch, and there they were. Faces behind curtains, faint movement behind frosted glass, the shifting presence of eyes that darted away the moment I looked. The street wasn't unfriendly. It was anticipatory. Like everyone was waiting to see how I would react. By noon, the second notice arrived. Then a third, grass length, mailbox paint. A tiny chip in the concrete walkway, something that must have been there for years. The speed of the notices wasn't random. It was coordinated. By the time afternoon stretched across the sky, a soft knock came at the door. Light, controlled, practice. I opened it, and there stood two figures, a man in a collared HOA shirt, clipboard in hand, and a woman standing rigid behind him, offering a polite smile that never reached her eyes. The man introduced himself as the president of the association, though the tone he used made it feel more like a title of power than responsibility. His words flowed smooth, rehearsed, laced with controlled friendliness that held something cold beneath it. He explained the rules, the expectations, the standards of Maple Ridge Estates. And then he stepped aside. Behind him stood her, Karen. Same clipboard, same sharply controlled posture, same eyes that measured every detail around her as though scanning for weaknesses. A truck pulled up behind the property, on the other side of the fence where undeveloped land stretched toward the woods. The sound of clanking metal, muted voices, and the thud of heavy equipment filled the air. I stepped onto the back porch, and that's when I saw it. Construction, fresh lumber, concrete bags, workers measuring along the fence line. Except the measurements were wrong. The men weren't building on their property. They were 14 feet over. Onto mine. I watched the foreman gesture toward my yard, waving his tape measure casually like it meant nothing. Another worker marked the ground with orange spray, laying lines of territory they didn't own. Something deep inside me tightened. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was deliberate. Later that evening, when the noise finally quieted and the last truck rolled away, I walked the perimeter. The earth was freshly disturbed. Stakes driven deep. A tarp thrown over supplies. The air still carried the scent of sawdust and concrete dust. And then I found it, a laminated sheet pinned to one of the stakes. Approved HOA construction project. Signed by the HOA president. Co-signed by Karen. A shock of cold clarity settled over me. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about compliance. This wasn't about grass length or mailboxes. This was about land. Land they wanted. Land they were taking. Without asking. Without permission. Without fear. As the last light faded, I stood in the yard listening to the quiet whisper of leaves moving in the breeze. A quiet that didn't comfort. It warned. Somewhere beyond the fence, footsteps crunched faintly. Not loud, not close, but present, moving, pausing, listening. I turned toward the sound, but the shadows held their silence. Only the faintest impression of movement lingered, gone before I could focus on it. Night settled over Maple Ridge Estates with a heaviness I didn't expect. The houses glowed softly under porch lights, the street washed in tranquility, but beneath that calm exterior was something far more controlled, far more intentional, something brewing, something rising, something that had already chosen me as its next target. And as darkness wrapped around the neighborhood, I realized I hadn't stepped into a peaceful retirement. I had stepped into a battlefield, a place where rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons, where power wasn't voted, it was enforced, where strangers weren't neighbors, they were watchers. And somewhere at the top of it all, Karen waited, clipboard ready, eyes sharp as glass. The first moves had already been made. The game was no longer avoidable. It had already begun. Morning arrived without warmth. A dull gray sky hung overhead, and the neighborhood felt muted, as if absorbing the tension from the night before. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, trying to settle my thoughts, but the sight waiting for me snapped the calm in half. 3 envelopes, placed neatly on the welcome mat, aligned with unsettling precision. Violation notices. Again, grass length, improper porch decor, a single pair of work boots I left outside, a supposed noise disturbance I knew for a fact never happened. The timing was too perfect, too strategic. They were playing a psychological game. I gathered the notices and tossed them aside, refusing to give them power. But deep down, I knew the pattern. This wasn't about violations. It was about pressure, about making me bend, about wearing me thin before the real attack began. The fence line still bore the evidence of yesterday's construction. Stakes, markings, disturbed earth. And beyond it, the skeletal structure of the extension they were building, on my property, loomed like a trespass carved into wood and steel. I needed proof. Actual measurable proof. The survey equipment came out of its case with familiar weight. I'd spent decades working land, charting boundaries, resolving disputes. Numbers didn't lie. Lines didn't shift. Property didn't grow or shrink based on someone's ego. As I walked the yard, measuring, noting, mapping, a strange quiet hung over everything. The kind of quiet where you know someone is watching, but you don't know from where. Half an hour in, as I moved along the back line, the construction crew arrived. Engines rumbling, voices rising, boots crunching across the gravel. The foreman spotted me and stiffened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He whispered something to his crew. 3 men looked my way. Then all of them acted like I wasn't there. Not hostility. Confidence. The confidence of people who believed they were protected by someone above them. I finished my measurements and locked the equipment away. The numbers were clear. 14 feet stolen. Not inches. Not ambiguity. 14 feet of my land swallowed by their unauthorized sprawl. The HOA wasn't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were committing theft and covering it with paperwork. By noon, the workers hammered and drilled as if nothing was wrong, as if the world bent to their plans, as if the land they stood on was rightfully theirs. Inside, I set up my laptop, logged the evidence, and drafted a formal notice. Facts were always the first weapon in any battle like this. But before I could finish, a shadow crossed the living room window. Someone was outside. I turned slowly. Karen stood at the edge of the walkway, clipboard pressed against her chest, posture almost predatory. Her eyes scanned my front yard with a glance that felt more like a searchlight than simple observation. She didn't knock. She didn't wave. She simply watched, measured, judged. Then she turned and walked away, leaving a trail of silence behind her. The message was clear. The HOA wasn't backing down. They were escalating. Hours passed with construction rattling the air. The sound dug into my skull, a constant reminder of stolen ground and unseen enemies. Just before dusk, as the last rays of the sun stretched across the sky, I stepped out to get some air. That's when I saw her, standing behind the fence line, a figure among the shadows, partially obscured by the trees. Still, motionless, watching, not a neighbor, not a worker, someone else. The moment my eyes landed on her, she stepped back and disappeared into the brush. No sound, no trail, only the ghost of movement left behind. The hair on my neck stood up. I waited a long moment, scanning the trees, but she didn't reappear. The night thickened quickly, swallowing the last light. I went back inside, locked the doors, checked the windows twice. Something in my gut knew a shift was coming. Something harsher than violation notices and smug construction workers. Later that night, while reviewing survey files in the dim glow of the screen, a faint crunch echoed outside. Then another. Footsteps. Slow, measured, moving along the gravel path behind the house. The construction had stopped hours ago. The crew was long gone, but someone was out there still. I moved quietly toward the back door, heart beating with a calm intensity one hadn't felt in years. The silhouette appeared again, near the fence, lingering like a shadow detached from its owner. A whisper rode the wind, faint enough to question whether it was real. Not words, just breath. The figure turned, slipping between the trees once more. Gone. I closed the curtains and exhaled, not out of relief, out of preparation. Something bigger than a territorial HOA dispute was unfolding. There was a pattern forming, subtle, deliberate. Violations, encroachment, surveillance, footsteps in the dark. A silent observer near the property line. These people weren't just enforcing rules. They were probing, testing, pushing boundaries to see how far they could go. Inside the house, night settled with a heavy stillness. Only the hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. But even then, the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm that had already begun gathering miles away. A storm heading straight toward me. The next morning carried a heavy stillness, the kind that sinks into the walls and lingers beneath every sound. Even the air felt different, dense, unmoving, expectant. I stepped outside, hoping the sunlight might cut through the tension pooling in my chest, but the neighborhood was unusually quiet. Too quiet. No joggers. No dog walkers. No distant hum of lawn equipment. Just long stretches of silence, interrupted by the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt as though Maple Ridge Estates was watching me again, but now with something sharper, something almost hungry. As I approached the curb, I saw them again. 3 envelopes, perfectly aligned, edges crisp, each stamped with the same official seal. Another barrage of violations. Paint discoloration, debris near property edge, a supposed unauthorized surveying operation. A low simmer of irritation rose inside me, but beneath it was something else, clarity. The violations weren't mistakes. They weren't complaints. They were part of a plan, a pressure tactic, a written trap, a paper trail building toward something larger. As I turned to head back inside, movement rippled at the corner of my vision. A figure stood at the far end of the street, still, upright, watching. The moment I looked directly, they stepped behind a parked car and vanished. The neighborhood swallowed them. I returned to the house, the door closing behind me with a soft thud that echoed through the hall. I set the envelopes aside and walked into the kitchen, where the morning light fell in uneven patches across the counter. I'd spent my career reading land, understanding hidden borders, not just property lines, but the invisible lines people drew between each other. And now, one of those lines was shifting beneath my feet. A little before noon, the sound of engines drifted through the open window. Deep, grinding, mechanical. I stepped outside again and saw construction trucks crawling into position behind the fence. The crew was back, loud, confident, acting like the land belonged to them. One worker tossed lumber onto a pile with careless force. Another hammered a stake deeper into soil that wasn't theirs. The foreman barked orders while glancing toward my house with thinly veiled satisfaction. They weren't building a simple extension anymore. They were expanding it, fast, recklessly, trying to make the structure so large, so advanced, that reversing it would be almost impossible. As the day wore on, the sound of construction became a constant assault. Saws whining, hammers clattering, gravel crunching under boots. The frame rose higher, taller than had the day before, boards stretching like grasping fingers over my land. Every strike of the hammer carried the same message. This isn't yours anymore. By late afternoon, frustration pulsed beneath my ribs. I circled the yard, capturing photos, recording timestamps, documenting every measurement. The numbers didn't lie. 14 feet stolen, and still growing. When the sun dipped behind the trees, the workers finally packed up. Engines dimmed, tools clattered into boxes, and voices faded as the crew walked toward their truck. Laughing, chatting, completely unbothered by the theft they were enforcing. But the foreman lingered. He stood by the fence, facing my yard, hands resting on his hips. His expression wasn't anger. It was something worse, indifference, a certainty that no matter what I did, he'd still be back tomorrow. He turned away only when Karen appeared around the corner. She approached with that familiar, rigid posture, her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. The foreman nodded to her in a way that made my stomach twist. Respect, maybe obedience. Karen's gaze swept over the construction site, with approval. Then her eyes lifted to my porch, scanning for me with slow precision. Searching, waiting. Her expression carried something new. Not superiority, not annoyance. Confidence, a dangerous kind. She moved toward the workers, spoke quietly, too softly to hear, then turned and walked down the path without once looking back. I stepped inside as dusk spread across the sky. The house felt colder somehow, shadows stretching longer, corners darkening faster. I closed the blinds and locked the doors. I tried to distract myself, try to focus on paperwork, phone calls, logical steps. But the quiet pressed in, thick, heavy, unnatural. It was nearly midnight when it finally happened. A soft scrape along the side of the house. Barely audible, just enough to draw attention. Then another, slower, heavier. I moved quietly through the living room, heart steady but alert. I stopped near the back door and waited, breath shallow. Footsteps, not on gravel this time, on soil, close to the foundation. Deliberate, a shadow across the curtains. Someone was outside, someone who didn't belong, someone who moved like they knew exactly where the blind spots were. I reached for the nearest object, heavy, solid, just in case. But the footsteps didn't approach. They continued along the side of the house, slow and testing, as though the person was searching for something, or checking something. The whisper of movement brushed against the wall again. Then a low exhale, not quite a voice, not quite a breath, slipped through the thin space between the door and the frame. It carried no words, just presence, a presence that knew I was awake and listening. Then silence, a long, suffocating pause, followed by soft footsteps retreating toward the fence line. I waited, listening, watching. The figure reappeared to the curtains for one last moment, a faint silhouette. The posture wasn't aggressive. It was curious, quiet, like a predator studying its prey before deciding what to do next. Then the silhouette turned and vanished into the night. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the blinds closed, the house wrapped in stillness, the present still looming at the edge of my thoughts. Maple Ridge Estates had made its first moves, measured, calculated, coordinated, and in the dark, something else had joined the game, something operating outside the HOA's rules, something that didn't sign violation notices or carry clipboards, something that watched from the shadows and walked the perimeter of my home like it owned the darkness itself. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a dispute. It was a beginning of something much bigger, something that had finally decided to step out of the shadows and into my night. Morning crawled in slowly, the kind of gray dawn that feels more like an extension of the night than the arrival of a new day. My head ached from lack of sleep, my mind replaying the footsteps outside the house again and again. Shadows lingered in the corners, as if waiting to settle into new shapes. Even the air felt heavier, like the night hadn't truly left. When I stepped outside, the neighborhood looked deceptively normal. Sprinklers hissing across manicured lawns, the soft hum of distant engines, a bird perched on a fence post pretending the world hadn't shifted overnight. But something was off beneath the surface. It was in the way the air hung still, the way the street felt watched, the way people stayed inside just a little longer than usual, and waiting for me at the foot of the porch, for violation envelopes, stacked, perfectly aligned, edges crisp and straight, like someone had placed them with careful, obsessive precision. I picked them up and flipped through them without opening a single one. The words didn't matter anymore. The pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't trying to fix anything. They were trying to push me, break me, box me in from every angle until I couldn't breathe without permission. But that wasn't the only shift. Across the street, a curtain moved. A figure stood behind it, motionless, watching, hidden but present. The same shape from the night before? Hard to say. I closed the door behind me. The quiet felt suffocating. Each violation notice slid into a pile on the table, joining dozens of others. The pile was growing, like a timeline, a paper noose tightening inch by inch. I sat down, turned on my laptop, and began reviewing all my survey data from the day before. Every measurement confirmed the same truth. 14 feet stolen. Not by mistake. By design. Just as I began compiling a formal complaint with documented measurements, something unexpected happened. A car pulled into my driveway. Not an HOA patrol vehicle. Not a resident's car. A black sedan, government plates. A moment of confusion settled into the room. Not fear. Not relief. Just curiosity tinted with caution. The doorbell rang. 2 short chimes. Not urgent. Not polite. Neutral. A tone meant to establish presence without emotion. I opened the door. A woman stood there, tall, calm, wearing a sheriff's department badge clipped to her belt. Her stance held a practiced balance, the kind that comes from years of walking into unpredictable situations. Ghost gray eyes swept the porch, the yard, the stack of violation envelopes inside. Observant, controlled. Her voice carried no aggression, no friendliness, just clear intention. She asked about the disturbances, the construction, the late-night presence. She asked about the HOA, about Karen, about the workers behind the fence, about the 14 stolen feet. She didn't write anything. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened, fully, attentively, absorbing every detail. Then she walked the perimeter with me, slow and methodical, studying the stakes driven into the soil, the unauthorized materials, the structure rising over my property like an unwanted monument. Her expression never changed, but the stillness of her posture did, a subtle shift, a quiet intensity forming behind her eyes. When she finished walking the line, she stood still for a long moment, looking toward the trees, toward the very place where the shadowed figure had stood the night before, as if she sensed something, as if she recognized a pattern, as if she knew the story wasn't just an HOA dispute. Before she left, she gave only one simple warning: be careful. Then she drove away, her car disappearing down the street as swiftly as it had arrived. The house felt different after she left, like the presence that had hovered around the edges of property had retreated ever so slightly. Not gone, just pulled back. But the quiet didn't last. Later that afternoon, while reviewing footage from a small camera I'd placed near the back porch, something caught my eye. A brief movement, a flicker, a silhouette passing behind the fence line. The same figure, still, watching, then turning away slowly, disappearing into the brush. There was something deliberate about the way they moved, unhurried, unafraid, familiar with the land in a way that suggested it wasn't the first time they'd been here. I walked outside to inspect the area. The wind carried the faint scent of disturbed soil. A patch of ground near the fence was compressed. Footsteps, fresh, deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone exploring a boundary, not crossing it. Someone studying terrain. Someone planning. The construction noise returned at dusk. The workers hammered under fading light, rushing to push their structure further before darkness swallowed the sight. The foreman barked orders, glancing toward my house with a smirk he didn't bother to hide. As they worked, a soft hum rose from the tree lean. Not machinery, not wind, something else, something living. For a brief second, I imagined a shadow figure watching from behind the trees, blending into the dusk, eyes locked onto property, as if guarding some hidden purpose. The workers packed up quickly as darkness fell. Too quickly, as if someone had warned them, or as if the night held something they didn't want to be around. When their trucks pulled away, leaving the backyard swallowed by night, the atmosphere shifted. An unnatural quiet settled over the yard. Deep, heavy, full of unseen movement. The figure appeared again, farther away this time, near the trail leading into the woods. A faint silhouette framed by moonlight. Standing, waiting, observing. It didn't move closer. It didn't retreat. It just watched. And then, a single sound cut through the silence. Not footsteps. Not scraping. A branch snapping under deliberate pressure. A message, not a mistake. I locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and sat in the living room, the glow of the lamp casting soft light across the walls. The presence outside felt colder tonight, as if whatever was watching had grown bolder, or more patient. Maple Ridge Estates wasn't just tightening pressure. It was circling, coordinating, layering threats, on the surface and in the shadows. And as the night deepened, it became clear that the figure behind the fence wasn't part of the HOA. They were something else entirely. Something older in their movements, something colder in their silence, someone with their own reasons for being here, and their own role in the storm that was coming. Dawn crept over Maple Ridge Estates like a hesitant observer, casting long stretches of pale light across the houses. The sky was washed in muted gold, but the warmth didn't reach the ground. Not here, not today. The neighborhood felt different, tighter, as if the streets had pulled on themselves during the night, shrinking the space between homes, closing the gaps where freedom once lived. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, heavy with something unspoken. When I stepped onto the porch, the first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was a feeling, a pressure in the air, a weight, a presence that didn't belong. But there was nothing visible, no movement, no watchers behind curtains, no HOA patrol walking their usual morning loop, just stillness and the softest echo of footsteps fading somewhere down the block. At my feet lay another envelope, not in the neat, aligned fashion the HOA preferred. This one sat crooked, placed carelessly. The edge was smudged with dirt, as if it had been dropped, not delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No header, no logo, no seal, just a handwritten line. You're not alone out here. A chill crawled down my spine, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't Karen's handiwork. This wasn't HOA protocol. Someone else was leaving messages now. Someone who walked outside at night. Someone who watched from the trees. Someone who wanted me to know the shadows weren't empty. As the wind picked up, rustling the trees beyond the fence line, a sense of inevitability tightened inside my chest. Something was approaching. Something that had been circling quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to step forward. I pocketed the note and walked to the backyard, where unfinished lumber and steel frames cast fractured shadows across the soil. The construction site felt like a wound, raw, invasive, expanding into places it didn't belong. The workers hadn't arrived yet. Everything was still, silent. But as I moved closer, I felt it again. That same presence from the night before. A subtle shift in the air, like someone was near. Then I saw them. Footprints. Fresh. Leading from the tree directly toward my fence. Then stopping. Right at the boundary. The prints faced my home. Whoever had been there stood, for a long time. Long enough for the earth to settle deeper beneath their weight. Long enough to decide something. A faint crack echoed through the trees, a twig snapping under deliberate pressure. Someone was still out there. But when I turned, the forest stood motionless, pretending innocence. I retreated inside and locked the door. The rest of the morning dragged on with strange, unsettled quiet. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing today. Shadows clung to corners, stretching across the floor as the sun shifted. Elongated shapes that felt almost alive. By late afternoon, the construction crew finally arrived, though their usual noisy swagger had dulled. The workers kept glancing toward the trees, as if sensing the same unseen eyes I'd felt all morning. The foreman tried to hide his tension, but it crept into his voice, sharp, impatient, cracking beneath pressure. They hammered and drilled with anxious speed, eager to finish before nightfall, eager to leave before whatever lingered in the woods decided to step forward again. When the sun began its descent, painting the sky in deep oranges and bruised purples, the workers packed their equipment faster than usual. Engines roared. Doors slammed. Within minutes, the yard fell silent again, except the silence felt wrong. Not calm, not peaceful, watchful. I stood on the back porch, letting the last light fade from the sky. The tree darkened, branches twisting into silhouettes that looked more like skeletal hands reaching toward the house. And then, movement. A faint shift in the shadows. A figure emerging just enough to be seen. Tall, still, silent, not approaching, not retreating, just watching. Moonlight glimmered faintly along their outline, enough to reveal the slightest tilt of their head. Studying me, calculating. Not hostile, but not friendly, just present. A quiet stare stretched across the yard, thick with unspoken intent. The figure's posture was calm, almost solemn, as if they weren't there to harm, but to witness, or to warn. Minutes passed in heavy silence, until finally the figure stepped backward, swallowed by darkness as if they were part of it, a shadow returning to its source. Night settled in fully. The air cooled. The house creaked with shifting temperature. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then stopped abruptly, as if silenced. I checked the locks again, a ritual becoming second nature. The message from the morning sat on the table. You're not alone out here. The presence outside didn't feel like an enemy. Not exactly. More like an observer tied to something deeper, something waiting beneath the surface of this HOA-ruled neighborhood. But the HOA, their confidence, their speed, their violations, their construction, carried the chaos of a different threat. A human one, a coordinated one, a threat that grew louder and closer each day. The house grew darker as I shut off the final lights, leaving only the faint glow of the street lamp bleeding through the blinds. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water, the quiet pressing around me. Hours passed. Then, a thud, soft, outside, followed by another. Then the slow crunch of footsteps across the grass. Not toward the house. Around it, circling, mapping the path someone else had walked the night before. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The footsteps paused near the back porch. A faint exhale drifted through the screens. Not a word, just breath. Presence. Then, silence. The presence that had been standing outside for nights wasn't alone anymore. Something else had joined it. Something heavier. Something less patient. And as the minutes passed, one truth settled in like ice. The HOA wanted my land. But something in the woods wanted something else entirely. And both forces were closing in at the same time. Night weighed heavy over Maple Ridge Estates, thicker than any night before. The shadows stretched farther, darker, swallowing the edges of houses, as if the neighborhood were slowly sinking into something unseen. The silence wasn't peaceful now. It was too complete, too absolute, the kind that feels carved into the air rather than born from it. Inside the house, faint reflections trembled along the window glass as the last porch light flickered outside. The world looked dimmer than usual, as though the darkness scraped away part of the sky. The footsteps that circled the house earlier had left a pressure behind, a bruise in the air that hadn't faded. Whoever had been out there wasn't wandering. They moved with intention, mapping routes, tracing paths, measuring responses. Not trespassing, testing, and deeper in the woods beyond the stolen fence line, something else waited. A quieter presence. Older, patient, watching the HOA's growing construction with the interest of something that had lived in the land far longer than any human boundary. Sleep never came. Not truly. I drifted in and out of uneasy half-rest until the faintest gray touched the horizon. Morning arrived as a smear of cold light through thin clouds. The air felt damp, metallic, carrying the scent of unsettled soil, the unmistakable smell of fresh digging. I stepped outside and immediately saw it. Footprints again, but not just along the back fence. They led around the side of the house, then across the yard, then toward the front porch steps, and stopped just short of the door, a single foot length away, as if someone had stood there for a long time in the dead of night, watching the shape of the house in silence. A shiver crawled under the skin. I followed the prints back toward the tree-line. They vanished abruptly halfway across the yard, as if the person had lifted themselves out of the world entirely. Half a trail, half a ghost. Before I could think deeper, engines growled in the distance. Construction trucks rolled toward the backyard again. But something was different today. The crew moved slowly. Nervously, they kept glancing toward the woods, their shoulders hunched as if anticipating something. Even the foreman, always so smug and self-assured, moved with the stiffness of someone being watched. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of something else. They worked faster than usual, erecting new beams, extending platforms, laying down boards with frantic precision. Every clang of metal, every hammer strike carried an undercurrent of urgency, like they wanted to get out before daylight slipped away and the woods came alive again. By midday, the sheriff's deputy returned. Her presence shifted the air, steady, grounded, cutting through the tension. She walked the yard slowly, absorbing every detail with sharp, experienced eyes. She studied the construction, the boundary line, the encroachment, the strange footprints. Her expression hardened at what she saw. She sensed it too, the two threats in motion, the HOA and the presence in the woods. She didn't stay long. She didn't need to. Her arrival sent ripples through the street, curtains twitching as residents peeked out, their faces tight with unease. As she drove away, the quiet deepened, as if the neighborhood were holding its breath again. Hours passed. Shadows lengthened. By evening, the workers finished another large section of the stolen structure. The frame now towered inside my property like the ribs of some artificial beast, growing day by day, bone by bone. The last truck peeled away. The sun bled into the horizon, and night rose like a slow tide. I stepped onto the porch as darkness thickened around the houses. The wind carried the faint murmur of branches moving in unnatural rhythm. Then I heard it, a sound from the woods, soft at first, a distant stirring, a rustle that wasn't a breeze, then heavier, closer, footfalls pressing into damp earth. I scanned the tree-line, my breath tight. The figure emerged again, not hidden this time, not blending into shadows, stepping forward slowly, deliberately, as though revealing itself was part of the plan. Moonlight stretched across the yard, catching the outline of a tall frame, lean, unmoving, carved from stillness. The presence emanated from it, like a cold radiating through stone. It paused at the boundary where the workers had erected the new stakes. It stood there, silently studying the structure, studying the theft, studying the violation of land. Then it turned its head toward me. The stillness that followed felt ancient, like the earth itself held its breath. The figure lifted one hand slightly, as though signaling, or warning, or acknowledging me. Then it stepped backward and vanished into trees without sound, absorbed by darkness, as if it had never existed at all. But the message was clear. It wasn't here to scare me. It was here because something far worse had begun. The night deepened with a new weight. A pressure rose in the air, an invisible tightening that stretched across the entire street. The kind that comes before storms, before ruptures, before collapses. I stayed awake until dawn again, listening, waiting. watching shadows move across walls like quiet observers. As the first sliver of morning light cut to the blinds, the neighborhood stirred, but hesitantly. The routine movements of residents taking out trash or walking pets felt stilted, performed more out of obligation than habit. And then came the shattering moment that split Part 7 from Part 8. A scream, high, sharp, cut short abruptly. Not from my yard. From deeper inside Maple Ridge, somewhere behind Karen's house. The scream echoed along the street, rising over rooftops like a wound ripped open. People rushed out of homes, calling out, searching, panicking. But within minutes, the neighborhood fell into an eerie hush again. People retreating indoors, slamming doors, locking them, drawing curtains. Something had happened. Something the HOA had no control over. The rest of the morning unfolded under a grim fog of tension. The HOA board patrol car made slow loops around the block, trying to appear authoritative, but even from a distance they looked rattled. Something had shaken them. Something that didn't follow their rules, their procedures, their carefully crafted facade of control. Around noon, I walked the yard again, documenting every inch of construction. The stolen structure had grown so far over the line that it cast a shadow across my grass, a literal overshadowing of my property by their expansion. But something else caught my attention. Mud, smeared across the wooden boards. Long streaks, thin lines of disturbed soil, trailing from the woods toward the fence. Then stopping abruptly as though the figure had reached the barrier, but refused to cross into the domain the HOA had stolen. A boundary was being contested on two fronts. The HOA fought for land, but the shadow in the woods fought for something deeper. By late afternoon, a small group of residents gathered on Karen's porch. Their faces were pale, eyes tense, whispering in circles. Whatever had happened behind her house earlier had left marks. Physical or emotional, I couldn't tell yet. Karen herself stood rigid on her doorstep, her usual authority shaken. She clutched her clipboard tightly, fingers white around the edges, as if holding it was the only thing keeping her steady. Something had cracked her armor. The wind picked up, carrying faint sounds from the greenbelt again. Branches snapping, leaves shifting, the distant snap of underbrush beneath deliberate steps. Karen heard it too. Her eyes darted toward the woods. Fear, real fear, for the first time since I arrived. She looked human. Night settled far too quickly, dragging the world into darkness with unnatural speed. Porch lights flickered to life across the street, but even those lights felt dimmer, swallowed at the edges by something unseen. Inside, I tried to focus on my evidence, on logic, on steps forward. But logic held little power tonight. The presence outside had grown too bold, too steady, threading itself into the fabric of the neighborhood's fear. Then, late into the night, a new sound broke the silence. A low, rhythmic knocking, not on my door, on without outside, the construction frame. The sound echoed softly, like someone tapping the beams with the back of their hand. Slow, measured, intentional. It wasn't the HOA. It wasn't a trespasser. It wasn't a worker. It was a presence again, warning the structure, warning the boundary, warning the land, warning me. The knocking stopped. Silence fell. Then footsteps retreated into the woods. Long, heavy, deliberate. Morning came with grim news. Something had been found behind the HOA greenbelt. Property flags torn from the ground. Boards ripped from the structure. Deep footprints in the soil. Too large, too heavy, too defined to match the workers or the residents. The HOA launched into frantic meetings. Karen stormed across yards with a wildness in her eyes, searching for answers in places that once bowed to her authority. Residents avoided each other. Whispers spread across the lawns like infection. Something had disrupted their power, something that didn't follow their rules. And now the quiet suburban fortress of Maple Ridge Estates began to crack. From the shadows, outward, a storm was building. One made of human greed and something older lurking in the woods, and soon both forces would collide directly against my doorstep. Night fell like a curtain soaked in iron, heavy, metallic, suffocating. Maple Ridge Estates no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like an organism, a single, breathing entity tightening around its own secrets. Whispers crept across the lawns. Windows stayed dark even when lights were on inside. Doors locked earlier. Dogs wouldn't step past their porches. A quiet panic lived beneath everything. Even the air tasted different, like tension had its own scent. The HOA held a late-night emergency meeting. Cars lined up outside Karen's house, engines still warm. Headlights quickly shut off as residents hurried inside as though afraid someone was watching. Someone was watching. From the woods. From the shadows. From the stolen territory behind my fence. The presence. It had changed. It wasn't distant anymore. It was closer. And something had shifted in its posture. Not curiosity. Not neutrality. Warning. I stood at the back door, watching strands of fog coil along the tree line. The stolen construction frame towered above the grass, skeletal beams creaking softly under the night breeze. It looked less like a structure and more like a boundary marker, something the HOA had carved into the land without understanding what they were carving into. Then the sound began, a single low groan from the forest, like wood twisting under immense pressure, or something large moving between trunks too tightly packed to allow it. Another creak followed, then a snap, then silence. The forest wasn't empty. Not anymore. I stepped onto the porch slowly, letting the cold air wash over me. The moon hung low, diffused by thin clouds, casting washed-out light across the backyard. In the pale glow, something caught my eye, a shape, slumped at the base of the half-finished structure. Human, unmoving. My pulse tightened. I crossed the yard cautiously, every instinct on alert. As I approached, the shape sharpened into clarity. A man, face down in the dirt, clothes torn, arm twisted unnaturally. One of the construction workers. His tool belt lay discarded beside him, pouches ripped open. His helmet lay 5 feet away, cracked down the middle as though struck by something far stronger than a fall. No footprints around him, none except his own. But the marks on the ground said otherwise. The soil was disturbed, like something heavy had moved past. Something that didn't leave human prints. Something silent. I backed away slowly. My breath misted in the cold air, growing uneven at the edges. A distant scream tore through the neighborhood. Hi, brief, cut short, from Karen's house. I turned instantly. Lights burst on in several homes. Doors cracked open. People shouted from porches. The street erupted in confusion. And at the center of it, a figure lay on Karen's driveway. Not dead, barely conscious. Karen herself. Her clipboard shattered beside her. Papers scattered like fallen leaves. Fear twisted across her face. Raw fear, the kind she'd never allowed anyone to see. Residents rushed toward her, but she crawled backward on the concrete, eyes fixed toward the far end of the street, toward the woods, toward it. Her voice cracked, barely more than air, yet loud enough to slice through the night. Not the HOA. It's something else. Something in the woods. Then she collapsed. Panic swept across the street like a wave. People slammed doors shut. Curtains snapped closed. Alarms chirped. The whole neighborhood retreated inward, as though trying to fold itself away from whatever watched at the edge of the light. Within minutes, sheriff vehicles arrived, lights flashing, casting distorted shadows across the houses. The woman deputy stepped out first, moving with urgency but not panic. She kneeled beside Karen, checked her pulse, signaled for medics, then motioned another deputy toward the woods. Her eyes met mine from across the street. She already knew this wasn't just an HOA dispute. This wasn't territorial drama. This wasn't neighbor politics. The land was reacting. Something that had waited in silence for years was now awake. And the HOA's theft had disturbed something ancient. The deputy walked toward me, her boots quiet against the pavement. She studied me for a moment, then looked past me toward the frame cutting into my yard. Her expression hardened. Not fear, recognition. Something she'd encountered before. Something the department never talked about, because no report would ever capture it. Before she could speak, another sound ripped through the night. A deep, resonant tremor from the woods. Not a growl. Not an animal call. Something bigger. Something older. The tree leaned swayed violently. Branches snapped. Leaves erupted upward, as if some massive force moved beneath them. The deputy reached for her radio. But the radio crackled, then died. Lights flickered across the street. A hum vibrated through the ground. The air thickened with a static weight that made breathing harder. And then, the silhouette appeared, standing at the forest's edge. Not hidden now. Not shy. Not distant. Tall. Still. Watching. Its presence pushed against the night, like a storm front made of bone and shadow. It took one step forward, and the lights in the entire neighborhood went out at once. Darkness consumed everything. The final chapter had begun. The blackout smothered the neighborhood in an instant. One moment, there was a dim patchwork of streetlights and porch lamps. The next, the world dropped into an abyss of raw, breathless dark. Gasps echoed. Doors slammed. A child cried somewhere down the block before being pulled inside. I stood frozen on the lawn as the deputy's flashlight clicked on, a thin beam slicing through the heavy dark. It trembled in her grip, the first sign that even she wasn't prepared for this. The silhouette at the treeline remained still, but now fully visible, taller than any human by a full head, shoulders narrow, limbs long, its posture unnatural, not hunched, not upright, something between, as though it lived most of its life in places that didn't require human symmetry. When the beam of her flashlight touched its face, the light bent, warped, darkened, the creature's head tilted slowly, studying the deputy, studying me, studying the structure the HOA had carved into stolen earth. Then it moved, not quickly, not aggressively, but with a steady inevitability that made the ground feel smaller beneath my feet. One step forward. The frame in my yard vibrated. Bolts rattled. Lumber creaked like bones grinding in cold wind. Another step. Grass flattened in a widening path. Branches bowed outward as if pushed aside by unseen hands. The deputy raised her voice, steady but trembling at the edges, warning the creature to stop. It didn't. It kept walking until it stood just outside the stolen boundary, right where my true property line once lay. It paused, turned its head, and lowered its gaze to the lumber encroaching onto land that wasn't rightfully touched. It lifted its hand, thin, elongated, almost branch-like, and pressed it against one of the new beams, which screamed. Metal bent. The entire structure groaned as though crushed by invisible pressure. Beams split apart. Stakes snapped like brittle twigs. Boards cracked and folded inward. The HOA's stolen monument collapsed on itself in a single breathless moment. The deputy stepped back, stunned. Residents peered from windows, holding phones but not daring to record. The creature stepped away from the wreckage and turned toward me, and for the first time, there was emotion in its posture. Not anger, not threat, recognition. It had been watching me because I had not stolen the land. Someone else had. It had been waiting for the right moment to protect its territory. Slowly, deliberately, the creature stepped backward toward the woods, fading into darkness until only the faintest shimmer of movement remained. Then it vanished. The lights flickered. Street lights hummed back to life. Homes glowed again, one by one. The blackout ended as suddenly as it began. The deputy approached me, eyes wide but steady, breath tight. She knew what everyone now felt in their bones. The threat to this neighborhood wasn't human, but the humans had provoked it by stealing land, by carving into boundaries older than paper, older than any HOA, older than any survey line ever drawn. The HOA was finished, the construction destroyed, their authority shattered, their lies exposed. Karen was taken by ambulance, trembling, muttering about eyes in the woods that never blinked. The sheriff's department cordoned off the greenbelt and the destroyed structure. No officer dared step past the true property line. By morning, the HOA board dissolved, meetings canceled, rules revoked, the residents too frightened to speak Karen's name. And for the first time since I moved here, the neighborhood was quiet, real quiet, not staged, not controlled, not monitored, peaceful. I walked to the treeline later that day. The woods were still, calm, alive but not threatening. A small wooden stake rested at the boundary, one I hadn't placed. Old wood, carved with a mark I didn't recognize. A warning, or a gift, or a line that should never be crossed again. I placed it upright in the soil. A respectful offering, a promise. The air shifted, lightly, warmly, as if acknowledging the gesture. The presence was still there, watching, guarding, waiting, but no longer angry. The wind carried a whisper through the branches, gentle this time, almost approving. And for the first time since arriving at Maple Ridge Estates, I felt safe. The land had its guardian. And now, so did I. The end.